It's an absolute pleasure to join with you here today, and particularly to hear, just the impact that EVOC is having across the city of Edinburgh. And although I may not sound like it, the city of Edinburgh is not just a sort of another place to me, but it's the home of all my family. I have dozens of cousins living here. I'm afraid that what we've done over the years has ruined a lot of teeth in Edinburgh, because I'm the other side of the Ross's Edinburgh Rock family, the Davidson side of the Ross's Edinburgh Rock family. So I'm really, really pleased to be back. I've spent all my childhood winters here, and it's just so nice to be back. And Bridie gave me enough time off to go up Arthur's Seat yesterday, so fully back in action. But so pleased to hear, in a sense, how the purpose of EVOC aligns so strongly, both with the sort of agenda that I've been very keen to support in Wales, and also the consultation that's come out from the Scottish Government at the moment. And it's a consultation that I think is quite sort of deeply buried in a way. I think it's a really, really important one for organisations that want to focus on well-being and want, in a sense, to be able to work with public sector organisations and a government that is absolutely committed to that. And what has happened in Wales has been that having a government that now has to deliver well-being is absolutely transforming the imagination of the people in Wales, transforming the imagination of organisations, because they are very excited at the fact that things that they've wanted to do for years, but probably with the exception of the money bit of it, because money is incredibly tight at the moment, but things they've wanted to do for years, they can now do because it absolutely fits with this new agenda. So I'm just going to very quickly talk through, what is happening in Wales, which may or may not make you think that it's really worth responding to this consultation in Scotland and thinking about what you want as an organisation. What you want, what's your ask, your big ask of all the public authorities in Scotland, of the government, if you could get what you wanted in legislation like that. And now I'm going to try and change slide and can't. So I'll just call on my handy assistant from EVOC. Aha. Anyway, here it is. This is the world we live on. This is actually from a science exhibition in the Natural History Museum about 10, maybe more years ago. And it just feels to me as though it's kind of important to remember that we only live on one planet. We often behave as though we live on many more planets, and some countries behave as though we live on many more planets, and yet other countries behave as though they're not even using the resources of one planet. So just look at it and think that just in the last few days, this world has seen huge flooding in California, massive wildfires in Chile. It's seen a landslide that's killed, they're not even sure how many yet, in Indonesia. And you'll all know that every day throw up new stories in terms of what's happening in the context of climate and nature. But it always feels so far away. And I think sometimes it's just quite a good idea for us to sort of look at the fact that here it is, the slowly revolving planet that doesn't take any notion of territorial boundaries when we look at these things facing us. So they really are big global challenges. And I mentioned about how countries are using perhaps many more planets than we have available. And this notion of an ecological footprint that some of you may well know, and I always think it's a good one, because I remember testing it on a child of 3 and just sort of saying, well, how many planets have we got? And she sort of looked at me and sort of said, "One, silly." And it was like, yeah, one, silly. But if you use more resources than we have available on this one planet of ours, then in a sense, you're actually taking resources for others and taking resources from ourselves. So we're in this position now where at the top right-hand side, you have Qatar, who uses all their equivalent resources in terms of their population up by not even halfway into February. So they actually need 8 planets in terms of how many planets they have available to them. And yet India isn't even on this chart, because even with the huge population of India, with the ambitions of India, India is still not using up to 1 planet worth of resources, even with its massive population. So it's a very unequal world, and you're an organization very committed to fairness. So if we're going to be fairer about our use of the world, then what do we need to do to change our behaviour? Now, back in 1999, you got a parliament, we got an assembly. We didn't quite make it to a parliament then, but we have one now. But the critical thing that happened in Wales that didn't happen in either Scotland or Northern Ireland at the time was we had a duty to promote sustainable development in everything that we did. And we used the Brundtland definition of sustainable development, which some of you will know. Development that meets the needs of the present without compromising on the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Sounds really sensible, but of course, most of the actions we take when we're trying to just abstract resources as much as possible are doing exactly the opposite. So when we are silent, when we don't actively campaign on these things, we are actively taking the world away from our grandchildren. And I often think about the fact that my mum is heading for 100, and my granddaughter, my youngest granddaughter, is 3, and between them they'll know about 200 years of life. But the life my mother lived was to see after the war this sort of massive burgeoning of kind of compassionate legislation that wanted to make sure that people were properly housed, they were educated, new health provisions put in place, clean water, all these sorts of things. And yet now we're in a position where we have to have the same kind of big vision in terms of the kind of challenges about to meet us. And what Wales did was, and I was just very privileged to be the minister at the time, was that we found delivering on that duty to promote really hard because it wasn't properly defined and people could interpret it in different ways. And then we found out, after 10 years of trying, that actually it didn't mean anything. That a duty to promote is like a duty to have regard. Some of you will know of legislation that includes that in. We've all got it. And have regard means you can go, I've had regard, and that's it. But actually, I therefore just kind of decided that if we were serious, and we were serious as ministers about this, if we were serious about it, we had to make it a duty to deliver. And that is effectively what has happened with the creation of a Wellbeing of Future Generations Act in Wales. But it also had some other elements to it. And your consultation at the moment is asking about what the shape is of the legislation that you'd like to have in Scotland. And it's using lots of examples from Wales, only because Wales is the only country that's done this stuff. So in sort of sisterhood, it's kind of like, not all the way we've done things will work for you, because you're a different country. You'll see at the bottom on the left-hand side, the 4 pillars that underpin the legislation. First one, most importantly, is about culture. And that's not individual cultures, that's the cultures of our nations. What makes us tick? What are our values? And what is our society? What's our environment? What's our economy? And although we have some similarities, there'll be a lot of differences in that. So you will want to think about an act that takes those elements on for you in the same way as what I'm going to describe took Welsh elements on for us. The other thing that is very different from this legislation is that it doesn't just have the goals, which you can see in the sort of circle around the white picture of Wales in the centre. They're sitting within the Sustainable Development Goals, so it's linked to both the UN definition of sustainable development and also to delivering on the UN ambition. And some of you may have noticed that on my first slide, on a picture of my book about it, the UN said, what Wales does today, the world will do tomorrow. Well, it didn't, I have to say. Tomorrow is a movable feast in UN terms. But what they were really talking about was the fact that, well, we actively linked our legislation to the Sustainable Development Goals. And they're all meant to be delivered by 2030. And most countries don't have a plan for delivery, even though 192 odd member states have signed up. So on the face of the legislation, there are these 7 goals, but also the 5 ways of working on the left-hand side. And this is the really important narrative in terms of the engagement between government, the public services, and the voluntary and community sectors. The government and all the public authorities that are responsible to the Welsh Government, they have to think long-term. They have to think preventatively. They have to collaborate in order to achieve outcomes. They have to integrate those outcomes. So you can't just say, I'm going to do prosperity because I really want to carry on with my old economic thinking. They have a duty to maximize their response to all the goals. And that means that they can't just pick 1 or 2, but they have to think about co-benefits. And this is the one which potentially is going to be absolutely game-changing. They have to involve people about whom decisions are being made. And that is something which governments, including the Welsh Government, have historically not been good at doing. But actually, if in these much more tricky times with so many challenges facing us, involving people about decisions that are made about them is absolutely critical to get buy-in. And the other bit on the face of the act, and here you have it, the goals. They are all integrated in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. But if you look at these, and I'm sure Bridie will share these slides with you all after the session, a prosperous Wales is now innovative, productive and low carbon, but recognises the limits of the global environment. So not only is this actually the first piece of legislation in the world to enshrine a response to the Sustainable Development Goals, we think it's also the first that explicitly recognises environmental boundaries, planetary boundaries, the limits of the global environment. So how we use resources has to be efficient and proportionate, and that we have to do it in the context of acting on climate change. But this is not about killing an economy, but creating a new kind of economy, generating wealth and employment opportunities, allowing people to take advantage of the wealth generated through securing decent work. And I love the fact that decent in this context is now recognised as a term, a description in law. And all the other goals you'll see similarly. It's about, healthier Wales is not about more doctors, although we want them, and more ambulances, we want them, and more hospital beds, and we want them. But it's actually, how do we create a society in which people's physical and mental well-being is maximised, which is something that as EVOC you've worked on a lot. How do we create a society in more equal terms that enables people to fulfil their potential? How do we sponsor cohesive communities? How do we enhance biodiverse natural environments? How do we reflect on our cultures and languages? I mean, Welsh and English are of equal measure in Wales, and there's legislation and a commissioner to support that. And very importantly, so that we don't offshore our emissions or behave badly across the border in other countries, how do we make sure that whatever we do globally, we do in the same spirit as we've done in Wales? And these things obviously need some accountability. So Bridie referenced at the outcome that the first Future Generations Commissioner, who had a 7-year term that finished last year, because the Act only passed in 2015 and came into force in 2016, the Commissioner is largely there as a critical friend to help and support, to encourage collaboration, massive interest in creating public and voluntary partnerships, and particularly because so many organisations in the voluntary sector in Wales deliver obligations that are placed on the public sector. And I know that'll be exactly the same here. So how we make sure that actually those people working in the voluntary and community sectors benefit from all the co-benefits of this legislation. It's audited through the normal channels, which is a very important element, and people could take it to judicial review in the courts. So in terms of, if you look at the questions that the government is asking in the context of the Scottish consultation at the moment, and where the kind of the word have regard is in there, for example, in the consultation. And I've been able to meet with Scottish officials and a range of other organisations in the short stay I've had in Edinburgh. But I think there has to be a key focus on delivery. If we want to change and really change an agenda, so the focus is not the traditional focus, but a focus on human, natural and planetary well-being. This is a real change in values agenda. So you need it to deliver an outcome and not be something you can think about and then return to business as usual. So these points here are just, I've not used this slide other than coming to Scotland, but it's just kind of the lessons we've sort of learnt in Wales about the fact that not only does the Act apply to every organisation accountable to the Welsh Government, which you'd expect of a government, but I made sure when I introduced it that the Welsh Government ministers are also accountable to the Act. Because how can a government lead if it's not accountable to the big changes it's asking others to make? So things like that might be very important to you. We use the Brundtland definition because it's a UN definition. We linked the 7 goals to the UN Sustainable Development Goals because that means that what we do is considered to be world leading. But in fact, you have many more powers in Scotland. So it's possible that, particularly in the context of the justice system, that actually you can leapfrog what happens in Wales in terms of being world leading, because you can apply it to things that we don't currently have the powers to do. The notion of culture being added to the traditional pillars of sustainable development. And I should say that when I started the process in Wales, the front slide, I talked about the Wellbeing and Sustainable Development Bill, because that's what it's been called in the consultation. And the 4 ministers who came after me, who had the job of trying to steer it through, were kind of going, no idea what this is. It's got to say something that means something. How are my constituents going to understand what this is? And hence the well-being of future generations. So I think that, the bill has to have a name that works with people. And I think there should be perhaps Bridie, a competition in EVOC to come up with a name of the best piece of legislation you could make for Scotland that would carry out your ambitions. But it's important it's audited in the usual way. And it's important as well that its scrutiny and support is provided by an independent commissioner. Because remember, I said the Act applies to the government as well. Who scrutinises the government? And the auditor is a pretty heavy-handed approach to scrutiny, but scrutiny with help and support, which is what a commissioner provides, it has to do it to the government as well. And in fact, the outgoing commissioner, this picture of Sophie Howe, who came up just at the end of her first term, or her only term, because commissioners can't be reappointed, and we have a new one now. But they found that the Welsh Government, the DNA of Welsh public policy development and delivery, it says continues to be world leading. Well, when you're the only one in the space, of course you're world leading. But the interesting thing, the reach of the Act, enthusiasm and commitment, it's everywhere. It's right throughout the voluntary sector, right throughout the public sector. We've got loads of businesses who want to be subject to the Act, who are stepping up and volunteering. And we're kind of like capital of social enterprise and community interest companies. So they really are kind of like literally queuing up. How could we be involved? How can we use it to drive our businesses? But we also are still on a journey. The leadership and commitment has been there, but the processes haven't been there. So what are the processes that would enable you and as voluntary and community organisations to work most effectively with government and the public services in delivery of an equivalent and very much Scottish designed and delivered by Scottish people focused piece of legislation? And I just put up here some, sort of examples of things which on their own just look isolated. I mean, I kind of, when I was minister, I was able to create a curriculum that had a key focus on sustainability and change the national curriculum completely into areas of learning rather than subjects. And that didn't become a national curriculum until 2022. I introduced recycling changes. I introduced the first carrier bag charge, and people were going, well, these are really odd things to be doing. But when you've got a meta narrative, when you've got a values narrative about the well-being of future generations, they're sort of logical things. So I know in Scotland, because we were friends in Scotland, the Children Are Unbeatable campaign we had in Wales and Scotland, and we used to talk to each other about it. And then they both faded out. But when the Act came through, smacking was banned because it was a logical thing to do. So you suddenly see that when you change the context, when you change the values, when you change the outcomes, other things follow. And I'm really delighted. I mean, I've been out of government for 14 years, although I advise about 18 governments across the world on things like this. But the universal basic income pilot for all care leavers. I mean, how brave is that? To take one of the most disadvantaged groups in society who get the worst outcomes and are most likely to be in poor health, to get into trouble with drugs and alcohol, be in poverty, all those things, have poor educational outcomes, and actually give them 2 years of universal basic income. Only 2 cohorts because there's no money around at the moment, but that is being academically underpinned. So the lessons from that will be there for any other country who wants to do that. But picking such a hard group under this legislation becomes obvious. And the roads review, and not building a motorway just because some businesses asked for it, which would have destroyed a UN international habitat. The 20 miles an hour, which some of you may have heard of, because we did end up on the front page of certain newspapers. I'm sure that came into Scotland as well. But actually, the 20 miles an hour is already saved child deaths in the time since it's been introduced. It's already brought pollution down in cities. It's a set of co-benefits that people of Wales are pretty strongly supporting. And I was really worried about the opposition, but a really clever investigative journalist found out that actually all the opposition was coming from 3 political campaigns that were based in England, of 3 members of parliament who actually had been in their own constituency pictured with 20 is plenty signs. So I hope that now we get back to business as usual in Wales on this. And it's interesting that the 2 people who are vying to be First Minister in Wales at the moment, neither are planning in any way to change that other than to review its implementation. So I'm just going to quickly finish because I do hope there's questions. And I know that although this is being recorded, where the question space will be a private space for us to have a discussion, I hope. But what we've got at the moment is the work I'm doing is looking at how we can get to net zero Wales by 2035 in planetary boundaries using the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, therefore generating a just transition that is nature positive. And this is a really ambitious piece of work, and I've gathered people together, including people who across the whole world, who are absolutely kind of grumpy and ambitious about tackling climate this year as the science, sorry, this decade, as the science is telling us. And the way we're doing this is actually using those 5 ways of working. So we are thinking long term, of course, we are thinking preventatively. We are collaborating with a very wide range of organizations, both through 5 challenge groups, and you can see them laid out under the challenges. They're the big emission reduction areas: food, transport, buildings, and energy. But the big opportunity is education, jobs, and the future of work. How can we change things around that to be more beneficial? We have a set of domains, those sort of governance things about how can we finance this? How does it get regulated? What are co-benefits? What are disadvantages? What does a just transition look like? What's the AI implications? How do we future-proof? You know, all the things that you have to think about if you're going to generate pathways. And our job is to create 10-year pathways, 2025 to 2035. So if you look at this bullseye, and I'm putting us in the bullseye because when we publish, we will be in the bullseye in terms of the kind of things that we propose. I predict the Daily Mail. But the planetary boundaries, the things we can't step beyond if we want a livable planet that is particularly livable for humans, as well as all those elements of nature that feed us and support us. The Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, constraining what we do so that we are absolutely determined to be just and nature positive. The challenge is defining emissions reduction, because you can't get net zero without it. The domains in which we have to operate, the context and the values in which we do our work. And I've just wanted to show you this slide because participation and engagement is so slippery generally, and we are putting this at the heart of what we're doing. So we're going to do some particular testing of our ideas. I mean, we're really just a big task and finish group with now hundreds of members, including extra expert reviewers. But we're testing with a series of organisations, and I think the Scottish Government might be one of them, Carnegie will be one of them, and I wonder whether EVOC might be one of them, that would have an event sometime in May and just look at the kind of conclusions we've got and say, you know, is this acceptable? Because actually to get to net zero in 10 years, it might be impossible doing it in a just way. But if we don't start now, we can't allow people to wait until 2040 to start on the sort of challenges that science is showing us that we're facing more and more every year. So we're building a large number of organizations who will test our and socialize our conclusions. We're working through all our stakeholder groups as well to actually talk to the public. We're allowing we've got external evidence coming into us, and we're synthesizing that now. And if anybody feels they've got anything they want to offer into this space, you know, really good solutions in terms of energy and food, connections and buildings, or education, jobs and the future of work, just get in touch with me and we'll still take it in, because we're taking in evidence till the end of March. And when we go out to our partner organisations, we'll then be actually reporting on what they say. So unlike a government, we won't be saying, thank you very much, and we're going to do this. We'll be saying, well, this is the feedback that we're having. So if you did this, you've got to take these things into account. And we're reporting on all of that. And we've got academic underpinning. And I'm a huge supporter of the idea that every major action should have academic underpinning, so that there is a really strong evidence base which is independently being given to us by the Wales Centre of Public Policy. And anybody can go and look at the reports they're giving to us on energy, on food, on transport, on the future of jobs, education, and work, and on buildings. And all of those reports are also looking at best practice in other places. So they're helpful to all of us about this journey. And this is participation and engagement, and particularly, although we're still looking for funding, I'm not going to ask you for that, we're still trying to fund a big citizens' assembly so that as part of this, while we're testing out in May, there is a citizens' assembly who convenes over a week so they can actually look at testing all our ideas and really thinking their way through. This work would not have happened without a Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. The Wellbeing of Future Generations Act would not have happened if we hadn't, right at the beginning of our devolution experience, had the Brundtland duty in terms of sustainable development. So consider it as perhaps that Wales has done the hard yards so that everybody else can do it better. And then that will challenge Wales to do it better. And just let's see if together we can turn a moment into a movement and really create a promise of a partnership between government and its people that is in the interest of current and future generations.